Hello, everybody. I'm here once again, the director for our New Zealand registered not-for-profit charitable trust Common Knowledge, and we hold the Birthing Better skills that hundreds of fathers and mothers and I developed in the early 1970s in the United States, and then I put into a charitable trust when I moved to New Zealand. And it was interesting because I moved to New Zealand without knowing it, that I had moved into a country that a few years earlier had implemented the most amazing maternity system, which was a midwifery-led partnership model with women based on everything that for the 25 years earlier everybody had wanted. And so we're going to talk about why everything hasn't worked out. I mean, really, honestly, to tell you the truth. And I probably wouldn't be here today talking to you if I hadn't lived in New Zealand and seen this wonderful system not function as well as it should. It functions brilliantly in that everybody loves having their own midwife, and 98% of women have a continuity of care midwife as a lead maternity care, even if they are under obstetrical care. And choices are venerated. That's the partnership model, is that midwives respect women's choices and that women can make choices at any time in their pregnancy and birth, and those choices should be respected. And yet, it isn't that it's failed, it's that it wasn't successful either on the goals. So the belief was that the 12.9% cesarean rate in 1990, when the midwifery model was put in place, which was above what the World Health Organization believed was acceptable, which was at that point 9%, was that midwives, once women's choices were respected, and once direct entry midwives that were not medical became the lead maternity carers, that there would be more natural births and more home births. And that hasn't happened, not by a long shot. There was never a lot of home births, maybe 10%. Maybe it's down to 5% now. And the cesarean rate's gone from 12.9% to somewhere around 26, 27, 28%. So we have to ask ourselves to begin with, are those the right goals? And this is what I'm doing this series about, is how the childbirth conversation in my lifetime has it was crazy from the start. I mean, it made no sense when I gave birth in 1970 in the US, and the 50 years that I've been involved in birth, it's made no sense since then. So I want everybody to know that when I gave birth in 1970 in the United States, the present childbirth trend of making birth plans and choices and researching what you want and don't want didn't exist. So I gave birth in 1970 when the first childbirth preparation classes were being taught, and those were Lamaze and Bradley. And it turns out in New Zealand it was Grantley Dick Reed. But because Lamaze, Bradley, and Grantley Dick Reed all promoted natural birth for low-risk women, this already made it crazy because all of us that were high risk then were left out. And in New Zealand, you had to have a doctor's prescription in order to attend a natural birth class, which was full of skills. And the other crazy part of it was narrowing the goals down to a natural birth, pain-free labor. How many of us have that? Without medical interventions. And medical interventions is a euphemism for medical assessments, monitoring, and procedures. And how many women are pregnant or give birth who really don't want any medical care around them in a modern world? They're as few as hen's teeth, really, to tell you the truth, and have been since the 1970s when I gave birth. So you need to understand that from early on the childbirth conversation, of the modern childbirth conversations, has been absolutely crazy. And it has led to where we are now, which is this incredible increase of shame, blame, guilt, disappointment, anger, frustration, and emotional birth trauma. So when I gave birth in 1970, the skills of Lamaze, Bradley, and Grantley Dickery that were focused on low-risk women to achieve those narrow goals of a natural birth, pain-free labor with no medical care or no medical interventions. It was very narrow, but the classes were taught all over the United States, and we were informed that they were for natural birth, and yet many of us were going to have assessments, monitoring procedures, because that was the evidence-based practice of the day, or the standards of care, or the guidelines to practice, or the guidelines that our obstetricians had, or the hospitals had. So we were using skills in and around all of the assessments, monitoring procedures. And if we had high risks, then many of us just felt, well, the skills aren't for us. Or if things changed in our birth, then many of us felt, well, the skills weren't really working. My labor was induced, and I didn't feel the skills really worked. And I was informed by my instructor when I called her that the skills don't work for induction, to which my thought was, well, that's crazy, right? and I'm not against the natural birth movement. From my perspective, it's been crazy. And the families that I've worked with, they've wanted something broader. They've wanted something that can work in their birth regardless of the circumstances. So we had no choices. And because those initial goals were very narrow and not enough women achieved those initial goals, the next group of natural birth advocates, which are the very famous ones that everyone knows, said skills they dismissed them. They basically said cows and cats aren't taught to birth. Women don't need to be taught to birth. We birth instinctively because women have always given birth. And so therefore the implication was we all know how to do it, which once again, it's crazy talk. Just because we do something, it doesn't mean we know how to do it. Our trust used to use the analogy of Department of Transportation and how you can have roads to everywhere, choices in childbirth. You live any place, you can pick any doctor, you may have a choice of hospitals. You can get there from here. And that there are guidelines to driving, there are rules of the road. You can choose what other car you want or whatever route you take. So childbirth and the Department of Transportation have a similarity. But if in the Department of Transportation, everybody behind the wheel of the car doesn't share the same set of skills, then there's chaos on the road. And society expects people to have the same set of skills and to use them at every nanosecond, a complicated set of skills that are adapted, adjusted, and have to be sustainable. But the natural birth movement screamed at me for years in the 70s and basically said, but driving a car isn't physiological and birth is. And they're right. They're absolutely right. I had to come up with another analogy. So we came up with sex and hunger, right? So sex is an organic, normal, natural, physiological urge. How many of you that I'm talking to now was a good lover the first time? How many times do we give birth? I've worked with families that have had 20 babies. So let's say we have 20 times to have sex. If we don't learn skills, we're not going to be a good lover. And if we don't use skills, we're not going to be a good lover. And how long does making love or sex last compared to how long it takes for us to do the activity of birthing our baby? So let's use hunger. We all get hungry. Any of us who have had kids know we've spent years taking things out of our kids' mouths. So humans don't instinctively know what's poisonous or safe to eat. And certainly none of us instinctively know how to cook. But we eat 3 or more times a day compared to maybe our 20 births in our lifetime, or our normally 1, 2, or 3. So we are comparing oranges to oranges, physiological, and none of those 3, giving birth, being horny and having sex, or being hungry and eating or cooking, we know how to do. We all have to learn them. So we need to understand that the choices that came into effect in the 1980s was a belief that if skills didn't work to achieve these narrow goals of a normal birth, pain-free labor, pain-free labor, and without medical care, that women should just choose what they want. So in the early 80s, women made birth plans that were pages and pages, details. It was like planning a wedding. And the difficulty everybody had, including the woman, was she didn't really know what mattered to her. So she wanted dim lights. Okay, we'll give her dim lights. And then she found she hated the dim lights, right? Okay. She didn't want pain relief and then begged for it. So what does that mean? And what did that mean to her 6 months or 18 months later? And what did that mean to the fathers or the others who were just coming in and being birth coaches? So we were told in the 70s to be a birth coach, the fathers and husbands. In the 80s, we were told not to coach, that women shouldn't be told what to do, that they instinctively know how to do it, and they should be left alone, and care providers should be hands off and sit in a corner. This is all nut stuff. And the fathers were then demoted to supporting women's choices and protecting the sacred space of birth. Well, how does a man protect the sacred space of birth? Exactly, right? And what is the sacred space of birth? Because that got tied to the belief that women had to feel safe to birth. Well, that's nuts. Women birth during war or natural disasters or famine. I mean, I'm doing this now as a massive hurricane is slamming into the coast of the south of the United States. And who knows what else is happening around the world? The wars and the famines, the displaced people in the refugee camps. There are women giving birth all the time. So women have fed this false narrative to each other. And that's been problematic. And one of the problems is a belief that women know what they want at their birth and should be able to choose it, and their obstetricians and midwives should be giving them the birth they want. So in the 50 years I've been involved in the birth globally, I have asked tens and thousands of women, well, how'd your birth go? Did it go to the way you wanted it? And maybe that many out of tens and thousands said, yeah, it was pretty much the way I'd planned. Right? The rest of us went, nothing like I thought. And that's true, because the truth is, compared to the nut stuff, is there's no way to know what your birth is going to be like. You don't know until it unfolds, and you can't practice beforehand. And babies don't come to plan. They just don't come to plan. So when the natural birth movement, the home birth midwives were saying women should have choices, there's truth to that. You want women to be able to choose to birth at home and to be okay about that and to have any necessary medical care if she needs it. And you want women to be able to some degree, have some control over the health care that she receives. You know, we should just be able to do that. And we also have to understand that the reason that the modern medical profession is so sensitive to risk aversion is because we as consumers demanded that. And the only way I know that is I've lived through this. Because when I gave birth in 1970, 95% of us labored and had a vaginal birth because the medical profession just was not sophisticated enough to do anything about our twins or our breeches or our partial placenta prevas or our short cords or long cords or Rh negative. RhoGAM hadn't been developed until the 1980s. And the cesareans were a classical cesarean, major abdominal surgery done to save a woman's life or something major. The rest of us labored. And we labored whether we had risks or not, whether those risks became problems. And most problems don't end up with a tragedy. But we labored whether we felt good about it or whether we suffered or whether we had a short or we labored for days or whether we had a good outcome or a tragic outcome, whether we healed well or whether we were left eternally with damage to our body. So when the natural birth movement evokes the lack of cesareans, they are also believing inaccurately that the 95% of us that birth, they all labored. Well, that didn't mean that labor was pleasant. because really the biggest issues that most women had throughout time and across the world is that we suffered in childbirth, which was a lack of skills. And this is where we have to come up to now, which is what is the difference between choices and skills? And I'll do another one in this series about skills. So choices, the idea of a choice-based trend that we're still in, because that choice-based trend basically said skills don't work. Well, skills didn't work because they were focused on low-risk normal births to begin with, rather than the truth, which is 100% of pregnant women will give birth one way or another. And it was on three narrow goals: to have a natural birth, pain-free labor with no medical interventions, rather than the bigger goal, which was women's suffering. This is a euphemism for women's inability to cope well with the naturally occurring pain of contractions, or to handle the naturally occurring pain of contractions, or to work through them, or to deal with them, or to handle them, or to stay on top of the natural occurring pain, or to feel in control when you can't control dick about your birth. So if that had been the initial goal, and if everybody had been said, 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth, it's always an activity every woman is doing with her baby, 100% of pregnant women should have skills and use those skills, then we would have, within my generation, reduced the suffering. And that would have gone a long way to having better births and birthing better. Because when women cope better, they allow labor to progress better. And this is going to be for another series. However, when women don't cope, they instinctively move into positions that back their labor off because it's intense. And when they back their labor off, they're in labor longer because the baby doesn't efficiently move down through and out their body, which means that they, without intent, can cause a longer delay in first and second stage, which, whether you believe it or not, and please do, is that when women get tired and when babies get tired in the modern world, the medical profession would like them not to suffer and would like issues not to become problems and problems become tragedies. So they use medical care. So when women first were given choices, we made long birth plans. And we knew within the first few years of the failure of birth plans because too many women got pissed off months after the birth. They got pissed off at their partners. They got pissed off at themselves. They got pissed off at their birth professionals. And that's what started the rise of the shame, blame, guilt, disappointment, anger, frustration, and emotional birth trauma that we see today. Women are pissed off because they're not getting the birth they want. What do we want as women? Well, the bottom line is a safe birth for ourselves and our baby. But if you push us, we want a positive birth experience. And if we don't get that positive birth experience, then we have to recover from that. And we have to recover from it as soon as our baby is born because we then have to parent. And if we have lingering birth angst, it's harder to parent because we're focused on ourselves and our own emotions. So birth choices were never going to work. It was a great idea, kind of, but it should have married with skills. So if back then we had said 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth, everybody should self-learn skills, use those skills to work through the activity of giving your birth, no matter where you birth, no matter who's present, no matter your circumstances or your beliefs or your choices or your lack of choices or the change of choices or what happens to or around you, we would have reduced the suffering and more women would have birthed better. And then if they had coupled that with choices, then the medical profession or the midwives would have continued to see more women coping and managing, more fathers helping the woman to cope and manage. And the choices that the women are making then become more realistic to the ability to achieve those choices. So where are we today? Well, our charitable trust wants to tell you that there has been an idea with words and actions, and to some degree systems in New Zealand, definitely policies, that have supported a choice-based system. The idea is that women know what they want at their birth, and it's articulated by saying that. Those are the words. And the action is to make a birth plan. And the other action is for birth professionals to respect women's choices and try to give them the birth they want. So that, in New Zealand, that's a policy. And that's baked into the midwifery model, that midwives respect women's choices and women make birth plans. This is a very unbalanced partnership because women expect the midwife to give them the birth they want. And nobody can give you the birth you want. You have to work through the birth. That's your job. So that first message is what is still in control today. So this is the message we want to give to you so you can articulate it to your friends, to your relatives, to your children, and if you're a birth worker, to your clients. So this is the idea. 100% of pregnant women give birth one way or another. That's just a truth. And giving birth is an activity each of us does with our baby. That's a truth, no matter the type of birth. That's just a truth. So we can articulate that simply. So the next way to articulate this new trend is that it should be normal and natural in pregnancy to self-learn birth and birth coaching skills, whether it's birthing better or another system of skills. That's fine, just learn them. And then use those skills as you work through the activity of birthing your baby. This should be normal and natural as a societal message. And if you're a birth professional or birth worker, your job is to tell your clients because you see more clients. This is not going to be a movement of women who rise up. And the movement of women in the natural birth movement was this tiny compared to all of us. So they just were organized and very vocal and pushed for changes. Good. We admire that. And they needed to include all of us, which they didn't do. And that's the nuts part, right? So if we can include everybody, because 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth, then as a birth provider, it's simple. You just tell women and men, pregnant families that come in, that you want to respect their choices, make a conventional birth plan, and hand them a handout of the skills-based methods you know, and say to them, you're going to have to do this activity. So here's a bunch of skills-based methods. Pick one or more of them. You can fill that in your leisure and say that from 24 weeks on, we're going to just pop into your notes what skill you learned. I don't need to know those skills as a birth professional. I just need to know that you've learned some so that others or myself can refer back to them. Because at your birth, if your birth plans unfold the way you want, great. But if you look like you're overwhelmed, right, we can refer to your notes and say, oh, 24 weeks you learned breathing. The woman might respond and say, well, I said I did, but I didn't. Okay, well, you got to deal with that. But if she did, and she doesn't look like she's using the skills, or her partner doesn't look like he's helping her using them, you could just nudge them. This is your baby's birth. You got pregnant, have a baby. This is an activity you're doing. Use your relaxation, use your breathing, use whatever other skills that you've learned and we've marked in the notes. And if, as a birth professional, I'm not at the birth, other people can see your notes. Now, what happens if the family is really doing well? Because in my generation, multiple millions of women and men use Lamaze and Bradley. And that's what obstetricians and in the United States, labor and delivery nurses saw. Us coping. 8 out of 10 of us coped and managed better And we weren't left with the shame, blame, guilt, disappointment, anger, frustration, and trauma. We felt proud of our births because we did something for ourselves in and around all of the medical interventions or assessments, monitoring procedures. So we need to understand the choices are great. They have to be realistic. They can't be lots of them. Because if, for instance, and this was a common one, I don't want pain relief. Okay. And then women don't have skills, they don't cope, and they want pain relief. This puts everybody in a dilemma, particularly the partner. But you said you didn't want pain relief. Well, you're not doing it. Okay, I'll support your having pain relief. 6 months later, the woman is, why didn't you stick up to me? Huh? 18 months later, I'm so pissed at you. I didn't want pain relief. What? Okay, we can't keep up. Okay? We can't keep up with choices changing. Right? Birth professionals are the same way. I mean, honestly, talking to 10,000 women, I can honestly tell you that women are pissed at birth professionals because the women have said, I don't want pain relief, and the birth professional said, you said you didn't want it, so I'm not going to give it to you. And the woman is saying, but I want it. And the birth professionals, particularly midwives, are saying, no, you can do it. You can do this, right? And women are traumatized, right? So we need to be more thoughtful about choices. Back up your choices with skills. As one midwife said to me, because she got all of her clients using Birthing Better because she had clients using everything else, and there was no consistency to how women coped and no consistency to outcomes. So she had everybody using Birthing Better when it first went. We first put it out in 2000. There's a VHS cassette and a book. But over the years, she pushed more and more of her clients to really get serious about becoming skilled because they were in New Zealand and believed that it was a choice-based system. And she went over to a woman's house who had a stack of catalogs, and she said to the woman, how much time do you and your husband spend looking through things that you want and don't want? Oh, we spend hours each night, but you haven't learned skills, right? So how can you want the birth that you're putting in your birth plan if you're doing nothing to work to achieve that? And that's the realism of it. And we have to understand that not every woman chooses the birth they have. Most don't. So if birth unfolds, what are you going to do? That's the word. We use the word labor, but not all of us labor. So what are you going to do if you're driving to the hospital, being prepped, and lying there on the table? You have time to use skills to breathe and relax and work together as a family. So that's important to understand because what we do reflects in how people see us. So if we're looking out of control because we don't have skills, everybody wants to save us. They don't want to see us suffer, and they don't want to see problems occur. But if they see us coping well, if we're behaving, doing, managing, if we're doing the coping, if we're doing the handling and the working through and the staying on top of and feeling control, those of us with multiple high risks are able to negotiate better with our care providers because our behavior comforts them and they're able to then do the assessments and the monitoring, the procedures without the distraction of us being overwhelmed or looking stressed. So on each of these talks, I wanted to give you skills because that's what all common knowledge is about. Families ask me to carry forward the skills. So here's one of our skills. It's called the positive and negative voice. When women believe that they can choose the birth they want and write a birth plan, and they don't get the birth they want, they have a negative voice inside. They have thoughts. A lot of us have negative voices inside about childbirth, but that's for another one of these talks. But people particularly who have written a birth plan or have a strong ideology about birth choices, if their birth doesn't unfold the way they want it, they have very negative thoughts. This is natural. However, what Birthing Better families learned is that you have to put in positive behaviors, that we have a split mind, and this is the skill. Respect the negative thoughts. Don't try to get rid of them. And if you go to number 2 in this series, it talks about fear in childbirth and how nuts that conversation has been. So if you have negative thoughts in your birth, honor them. They're just there. They're just there. They do not determine your behavior unless you don't have skills. So if you lack skills and you have negative thoughts, you're more likely to be reactive to the birth as it's unfolding. If you have skills and negative thoughts, you just honor the negative thoughts and you apply your skills. When I gave birth to my last child in 1982, it was a choice-based trend. Whereas when I gave birth to my first child in 1970, it was a skills-based trend. Lamaze hadn't particularly worked for me. The skills were inefficient, but I had participated in developing the Birthing Better skills for 12 years between the first and the last child. So I got a chance to use them in an unusual situation. My child was born 8 weeks premature. And so I was in a strange place and had this birth. I don't like labor pains. I don't know how many of you do particularly. Are they rushes? Can I get on top of them? I can with skills, but I don't like them. So, and I have very quick labors, so my contractions come very, very quickly together. I hate them. And so every time my contraction would start, my mind would go F, 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 F. I couldn't have a sophisticated sentence, but I would apply my skills at every single nanosecond. I applied my skills. I admired my capacity to apply my skills while I had these negative thoughts. And that's the skill I want to leave you with today. That's a skill that Birthing Better families develop. It's called the positive and negative voice. And there's an ebook, of course, of that in our online, because all our classes, our birthing classes, are now online. So if you make a birth plan that you feel you can achieve. Don't be asking other people to create the birth you want. That's not realistic, it's not fair, and it is leading you to a greater potential of shame, blame, anger, disappointment, frustration, and being left with emotional birth trauma. And we're going to talk about that in another one of these series. So follow us, please subscribe. Please tell other people if you like this. It's time to wake everybody up. And for many, many years, I was not public because the ideology and the natural birth movement has been very, very strong since the mid-1970s. And the concept of having skills has been very, very dismissed. But COVID came along. And when COVID came along, I came back out again and have decided I'm getting old. I need to leave a legacy because people of this generation do not know that at some point there were multiple millions of women and men who used skills to birth their babies in births that did not unfold at all the way they would have wanted. And we were left feeling empowered. So please become skilled and please use your skills. Thank you for listening. Talk to you again.